I don't want to like focus too much on this, but I know that there's probably a lot of listeners that are in that boat. You mentioned the 220 powerlifter that's using a sleep apnea machine. And I know a lot of powerlifters that are like that. Like they have so much dysfunction there that they're recommended to use a sleep apnea machine. Now I know you can't just plaster a Band-Aid on that individual and say, you need to do this, this, and this to get rid of that. But for the individuals that probably over time, they could get rid of that. They could, better things in terms of maybe the way they breathe or et cetera. What are some ways that you'd go about that to maybe get an individual off of using that machine at night? Because that would be ideal, probably.
Yes. So for me, I look at human function as how we operate when we walk and breathe. I think that's a pretty good, it's not shake weights, it's not suspension trainers, it's not BOSU balls. It's those two adaptations I think are furthest along evolutionarily. You don't do those well, you're not going to make it across the Serengeti. You're going to get eaten before you eat, kind of thing. So I think those two adaptations are the main drivers of human function. So from a breathing standpoint, a lot of it comes down to, like, especially with, let's stick with the example of the powerlifter. How is it that the muscles that we train disproportionately to powerlift affect the resting state and position of our rib cage, which will then create this transparency of function to the lungs and diaphragm beneath it, right? So for me, a lot of powerlifters present almost like this. Like if they were to lie flat on, and you watch it when they walk, they have a really hard time rotating and working through the transverse plane because they just have this stack of pancakes.
I find all this very insulting, by the way.
Oh, sorry.
I heard stack of pancakes.
So there's an ovoid adaptation to the rib cage, and this hand gesture is obviously exaggerating it for the sake of example. So that would be as if I was like laying flat on my back like this, and we took my rib cage out and faced it the same way. I would be like squished. Because you're holding hundreds of pounds. What do you think is going to happen to your rib cage? And what do your pecs do to your rib cage? What do your rhomboids and your traps do to your rib cage? They just pull and just take this thing that would be more circular and they kind of pancake it out. But we have muscles on the side that would be able to kind of compress this inward, right? And then create a more fluid dynamic, and for our scapula to start to work through this transverse plane, for our rotator cuff to start to work as a function of that scapula's ability to work through this transverse plane. Like our scapulas just move side to side on this little two-dimensional Tron game that we have when we have this pancake rib cage. But now if we were able to create a more circular rib cage by laterally compressing, understanding how the serratus and external oblique work in the matter of, in the inhalation and exhalation through the process of ventilation or how we breathe, and how that lateral compression can help offset this A to P compression. And now all of a sudden, when my scapulas move, they're not just purely moving across this Paper Mario sliding edge interface. There's a dimensionality across what's called an instantaneous axis of rotation, as these scapulas can now move through both like rise and run, right? Like we can start to rotate through all three planes. And guess what's now going to be able to function better, right? Our rotator cuff, our subscapularis, our teres minor, our infraspinatus, our rhomboids, we actually start to create space. Like when we're at rib cages like this and we're flat because all we do is bench and work through the sagittal plane, our rhomboids are actually our scapulas are actually inhibiting us from breathing properly. We need to, contrary to popular belief, actually be able to create space between our rib cage for that air to go, right? Because when we're walking around like this, the air is going here and not back there, right? So creating that posterior expansion of the air is now going to help double down in our position in creating a more circular rib cage, which then will allow peripheral function to be expressed through the scapula and the supporting musculature. So any drills that will, to kind of double back and hopefully give an answer to your question, exercises that will either laterally compress the rib cage, so things where you integrate like the function of the serratus, and the serratus has upper and lower fibers. The upper fibers, I would think of exercises like dips, like doing dips through full range if you have the lats and the subscap to support the anterior translation of the humerus in which to do so. Pullover, basically we build capacity to laterally compress our rib cage, working towards the overhead and working low into extension. So farmer's carries into dips, overhead press into pull-ups, and then to a more remedial sense, like side planks or unilaterally loaded farmer's carries to laterally compress a rib cage more. So basically, we want to take ourselves and squish in from the side and start to breathe into the back. right? So pronated grip rows, where I'm going to really exaggerate my scapular position. Most people are like, oh, why is he rounding his back? Excuse me, why is he rounding his back? Because he's teaching his air to start to unpancake his fucking rib cage. I got a bench right over my sternum. I can't breathe here. Tuck my pelvis underneath. My obliques laterally compress my lower rib cage. And then as I'm reaching and I'm breathing in through my nose, this air has nowhere to go but into the back, right? Like if you ever squished a Gatorade bottle and you want to like blow it up again, you just go, and then all the little dents in it come out. That's kind of how we need to manipulate our breath to expand our rib cage. So I really like overhead work, hyperextension work, and obviously you need to earn the rights through a progression of it. I'm not going to say, Mr. Single Ply Fascia Suit walks into the fucking gym. And it's like, all right, let's go. Let's get you on weighted pull-ups. It's like, I can't, what? Like, how? Right? So I think, there's a progression to that, but those are the kind of ends of the progression where we can begin to dose in exercises with laterally compressed, put ourselves in positions or shapes to create that posterior expansion. For most lifters, that's a pretty good heuristic or thought process to operate from.
I like how you gave us lifts to do rather than stretches. That's helpful because a lot of guys, like, as soon as you mention like a stretch or, I know some people like blow up balloons and different things, but you're like, I'm not a fucking clown, so I'm not going to like, put my feet up on the wall and sit there and blow up a balloon and feel my stomach. And it's just like a lot of these things I think they distract you from your training. I'm not saying that they can't be beneficial. I'm sure they have their place, but I always just like to get into training. So I'm appreciative of the fact that you just gave us like exercise. It's like, shit, I can do more farmer's walks. Mm-hmm. I can do dips more often. I can do some weighted pull-ups. It makes it easier to integrate that into my training.
Because I think like it's the right tool for the right job at the right time. Like my sponge is really good at cleaning pots and pans. It's not good at fending off intruders. A Glock 17 is not good for cleaning pots and pans, but I could probably get someone the fuck out of my place if I pulled it out in the middle of the night. Right. And so I'm glad you brought up like, the very basic blowing up balloons, lying on your back, 90-90 hip lift nonsense. Cause it's like, you need to create a Rosetta Stone between corrective exercise and exercising correctly. Right. I need to drive an adaptation to an athlete. Like your two central nervous systems are so wired for sound. Like you fight guys in house coats. You've deadlifted like however many in squat. Sorry, jujitsu. I just go jive with jujitsu, man. I don't understand it. You kick my ass house coat or not. I don't want to enter into it. But it's like, I need to make a change at the level of your nervous system. Like both of your nervous systems have gone through hell and back. I think for a second, unless you're Franco Columbo blowing up those fucking red water bottles or something, like that's what it would take for me to be like, okay, this stimulus is registering at a nervous system level that, both like really strong powerlifters, the sympathetic drive that comes with combat sports, as mentioned before, is an entirely different animal. So for me to think that, dude, I'm going to have an effect on your nervous system with this nonsense it's just ridiculous, right? And then like Mark the same, and I very similar, and that was one of the reasons where I had to cross apply these concepts to actual exercising correctly. So what I'm working towards is creating an index of like, okay, we know insertion, we know origin, we know how to kind of set up on machines or with dumbbells. Index the intent of your breathing for every exercise. Right, to understand how we can block off certain areas of the rib cage to then expand and compress other areas of the rib cage strategically to take, Pancake Man and actually turn him into a real boy. Right, that's kind of that it's an area of interest that I think has gone unexplored because breathing has taken. Not that it's a bad thing, but I think as deep a dive as people look into breathing from a biochemical, as mentioned, I think there's really a lot of very immediate impact that we can derive that will cross apply to the biochemical if we focus our efforts in the biomechanical.